Hello, my name is Tim Wolter. I'm going to be your host for a program called Pioneer Breweries of Western Wisconsin. I had intended to give this as a live program for the Chippewa Valley Museum as part of their larger programming on the experience of Germans in 19th century Wisconsin. Obviously, current events have made live presentations a little bit problematic, so we're going to try this in a different format, and I do hope that technical issues are not too much of a problem. So, Pioneer Breweries of Western Wisconsin. It's a fascinating topic. Like all immigrants, Germans brought with them from the old country the things that were important to them, like breweries. Um, What you see behind you is a very typical brewery of the Civil War era. And I'd like you to start critically thinking because what you see here will tell you a great deal about the brewing industry in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s in western Wisconsin. So, what you see here, well, let's start with what you don't see here. You see a brewery, but you don't see much else in the way of buildings. That's because most breweries were set up on the edge of town. There were several reasons for this, not the least of which was the desire to avoid any little pesky local laws. The next thing you see is in the foreground something that looks like a bridge, and that's exactly what it is. It happened to pass over a delightful little trout stream that ran right in front of the brewery. To make good beer, you needed good quality water. Another thing that you see is a hillside back behind the brewery. This is really important for reasons that to most people are not immediately obvious. Partly, you wanted gravity to do as much of the heavy work of the brewing process as possible. So there would be a road that would be up behind the upper levels of the brewery. Grain could be loaded in, and then you could use chutes, for instance, to dump the grain down into areas where it would first be malted, slowly uh, heated over several days, and then put into the brew kettle itself and made into beer. After that point, the beer would be transferred to kegs and have to be put back into a storage cave right set back into the hillside. This is because the brewers of Wisconsin at this point in time were primarily making lager beer. Lager is from a German word meaning to store, and lager beer was a relatively new innovation in the 1800s. The first few decades of that century, it had gradually made its way around Central Europe and had attained a fair degree of popularity and market share. Um, just in time for the late 1840s, when a whole series of very disruptive political events happened, collectively called the Revolutions of 1849. Now, if you know a few things about Germans, you know that they like to drink beer, they like to argue politics, and possibly that combination of things makes them, well, perhaps say and do some things they would have regretted. And when the revolutions of 1849 were forcibly put down by the imperial powers, there was a whole bunch of Germans who said, you know, this might be an excellent time to emigrate to the New World. And where better than to the new state of Wisconsin that had just been established 1 year prior. Couple of things just as sides to this photo. You can see some beer kegs stacked up there next to the brewery. You can see some guys standing in front of a overlarge doorway. That would typically go straight back into the storage cave. And off to the left, you see a woman standing in a fenced-in area. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that was a pig yard. Early brewers were very resourceful, and they said, well, what are we going to do with all this spent brewing byproducts, the grain and such? So a lot of them would just feed it to pigs, and that would be a little side business for them. So I want you to carefully focus on this image for just a moment, and we're going to switch to the next one. Here we are in the modern era. Same site, same orientation, nice sunny day. Obviously, the first thing you're going to notice is that, hey, it's not a trout stream anymore. Somebody has put a dam there and has made a nice little trout pond. But everything else is the same. You've got that hillside back behind where the road went. You have the foundations of the buildings that you were seeing. And if you look at that tallest foundation on the right-hand side of the picture, tucked down below is the storage or lagering cave. I'm a big fan of brewery caves. This talk started out in earlier forms as something called Forgotten Brewery Caves, and we will visit some of them, but I'm certainly going to attempt to be a little more scholarly when I can. Okay, a small confession. The slides I just showed you were actually not from western Wisconsin. That was from a little brewery over in Minnesota, just across the Mississippi River. But I liked the picture so much, I thought I would cheat just a little bit. But here I'm playing fair with you. This is a western Wisconsin brewery, Montman's Brewery on the edge of Hudson, Wisconsin. Here again, you can see some of the things that defined what you needed to have a nice little brewery. Uh, you've got water, you've got a hillside, and here you see something additional. You see great big piles of wood. The brewing process required a lot of fuel of some sort. You had to malt the grain, which was a process of slowly heating and turning over moistened grain over several days, and then you needed a good hot fire to actually brew the final product into beer. Uh, this emphasizes another reason why people tended to want the breweries to be on the edge of town. Just imagine the process of keeping a fire going for several days at a time with a bunch of employees who were allowed to drink as much beer as they wanted. Yeah, you can see where this is heading. Breweries in this era tended to burn down a lot. Next slide shows an image of the same brewery from a Sanborn map. Now, the Sanborn Company sold fire insurance, and they were extremely interested in places that they might insure that might burn down. So you get a lot of fairly detailed maps of breweries. This one atypically shows at the bottom the beer cave set back into the cliff there. I neglected to mention in an earlier slide that you had to put that lager beer back into the cave not for a few days, but for weeks to months to enable the lager beer to fully ferment and mature into a marketable product. Okay, I'd like to bring the program a little closer to home, specifically to Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. And let's meet a fascinating individual named Francis Xavier Schmidmeyer. F.X. Schmidmeyer had the first brewery not only in Chippewa Falls, but really arguably one of the first ones in western Wisconsin once you get away from some really early communities right along the Mississippi. And, of course, Schmidmeyer picked the ideal location. Right on the edge of town, hillside back behind, nice source of water, not just the Chippewa River, but some springs in the hillside behind. And to boot, it was a really nice location because that was where the ferry across the river was in an era before there was actually a bridge. Schmidmeyer came to town early. He seems to have been a member in good standing of the Notre Dame Parish circa 1855. His standing with the parish is going to deteriorate considerably in the years ahead. Here's an ad from 1866 indicating that Frank Schmidmeyer was the proprietor and that this brewery had been recently completed. Now, I've had to really pull this story together from a lot of different sources, and frankly, some aspects of it are fairly confusing. I can't even tell you how many variations on Francis X. Schmidmeyer's name I've had to wade through. But as near as I can tell, the story ran something like this. Schmidmeyer came to town circa 1855, probably started the brewery in 1856 or 57, ran it for a few years, and then in 1860 seems to have sold it to other parties and gone off to fight in the Civil War. He returned in 1865, came back to work at the brewery he had originally founded, apparently as the foreman. And in 1865, the place burned down 1 month after they stopped paying the fire insurance. So the reference to the brewery being recently completed actually is more of a reference to it being extensively rebuilt. Here is the site of the brewery as it was seen in 1874 or 5. I can't remember the exact date of this picture. This is what's called a bird's eye view. Delightful little 19th century creations that would look at a town and, well, let's just say enhance it a little bit. They made everything look bigger and grander. The brewery, you can see, is marked number 37 off to the left there. On the corner of that same lot is what appears to be Schmidmeyer's house. And that little flat area by the back corner of the house almost certainly was Schmidmeyer's original logering cave dug back into the hillside. A lot of the other things you see there are a bit of, let's say, artistic license, influenced by a bit of civic boosterism. That bridge, for instance, didn't exist at the time this image was made. That impressive-looking steamboat going up the river, steamboats really didn't visit Chippewa Falls very much. And if you look near the end of the bridge, you see presumably an elegant lady in a hoop skirt walking right down the middle of the road heading for the brewery. I'm guessing that also was a bit of artistic license. This is the same image, a slightly more accurate bird's eye view from early 1880s. At this point, the brewery has gone out of business and has been demolished. You can still see Schmidmeyer's house on the corner, now standing on a little pedestal of dirt. So somebody did some serious regrading of the site, apparently to create a railroad switching yard. Just out of sight on the right is a bridge, and this time it was an actual bridge that really did exist. This is the site today. There's nothing there but some blue Quonset huts used for storage. Delightfully, just across the street from this place, which was the site of the first brewery in Chippewa Falls, is the newest brewery in Chippewa Falls, an establishment called the Brewster Brothers Brewery and Chippewa River Distillery that just a few years ago started making beer and other beverages effectively on the same site that Francis Schmidmeyer pioneered back in the 1850s. Francis X. Schmidmeyer, what a character. I entitled this slide, The Many Loves of Francis X. Schmidmeyer, and having picked through his story in great detail, boy. So, when we first meet him in the 1850s, he was married to a woman named Ida. They didn't stay married. In 1860, in Eau Claire, she divorced him due to cruelty. I'm guessing that probably ended his good standing with the Catholic Church also. Schmidmeyer sells the brewery, goes off to fight in the Civil War, and then returns to work there again. When he comes back to town in the 1860s, he's married to someone named Margaret. But don't get too attached to her. She vanishes from history, and I have no idea where she went. Now, in 1870, the brewery, having been bought by a gentleman named Gebhardt, ran into a little difficulty. Mr. Gebhardt died. So, in a unusual tradition peculiar to the German brewing industry, it was expected that the widow of the owner would now have to marry the foreman. And she did. So Amelia Gebhardt marries Francis X. Schmidmeyer. This was done to help keep businesses kind of in the family, some continuity. And it doesn't seem like it was the happiest marriage. Amelia died 5 years later, and a lot of what I've learned about Francis Schmidmeyer is due to some very saucy material that I uncovered in her probate hearings trying to settle up her estate. uh, he says at one point, and this is written in his own handwriting, when I first married my wife, she had an old horse, an old wagon, and no beer. And another little quote, which I have depicted down below, Schmidmeyer writes, "For 5 years I ran the brewery for my deceased wife, for which I charge $500 a year. I worked for my wife. I was worth $1,000. Okay, Schmidmeyer in 1876, 1 year after Amelia dies, remarries Ida. This is his first wife. It didn't go very well. There were some promises made that he would help support some children that she'd picked up somewhere along the way. He didn't. He kicked him out. He threatened her with a hatchet. And so after just a few months, she moved out, and a year later, their second divorce became official. Something about Francis, though, he seems to have had some appeal to women, because the 1880 census finds Francis married to Ida, age 24. Now, I don't know quite what to make of this. Did he find another woman named Ida to marry? Maybe he was married and he couldn't even remember who he was married to anymore. Along the way, Francis has approximately 12 children plus a hard to define but generous number of stepchildren. The actual site of Schmidmeyer's brewery doesn't have really anything left to show you what was there. But if you take a little side trip about 2 miles away in Irvine Park, you will find this really nice cave. Schmidmeyer's initial arrangements must not have been quite satisfactory, so in the 1870s, he bought some land in what's now Irvine Park and either excavated from scratch or more likely expanded an existing cave to be the storage facility for his beer. When the Schmidmeyer Brewery went out of business in the late 1870s, the cave was acquired and used for a time by his crosstown rival, the Leinenkugel's brewery. Just as a little aside, I find Schmidmeyer to be such a fascinating historical character. And having put some information out there into the internet, I hear various things from descendants. I should mention that in the early days of my medical practice, I actually had as patients a couple of Schmidmeyer's grandkids, but they didn't remember much about Grandpa other than that he had fought in the Civil War. But I did hear not too long ago from someone who was a great-grandchild of Francis X. Schmidmeyer, who said that according to family lore, Schmidmeyer emigrated from Germany after he was disowned and left seminary school under some sketchy circumstances, possibly involving another wife in the old country. Don't have much to back that up other than it sure seems like it's in character with our friend Francis X. Schmidmeyer. All right, I mentioned the Leinenkugel brewery, and when I was giving this talk live, I was anticipating somebody in the back saying, all right, which Leinenkugel brewery? Because in fairness, there were multiple people in the extended Leinenkugel family in the brewing business in western Wisconsin. This little family portrait, of course, is Jacob Leinenkugel, who, with a partner named Miller, started the Spring Brewery in Chippewa Falls in 1867, so roughly a decade after Schmidmeyer. I'm really not going to talk too much about the Jacob Leinenkugel brewery because it's kind of boring. I mean, success is always a little more boring than extravagant failure. Jacob seems to have been a fairly happy individual. He looks pretty content here. His family may be a little less happy looking, but I guess we need to make allowances for the fact that back in the day, posing for a photograph involved sitting very still for a very long period of time. Here is an image of the Leinenkugel Brewery in Chippewa Falls with everything that you expect to see. Duncan Creek is off to the right, the brewery proper set back in the hillside, and along on the right-hand side there you see great big stacks of fuel. And of course, it's wood. There are some breweries elsewhere that used other stuff for fuel, but Chippewa Falls at the time had the world's largest sawmill, and wood was a cheap and abundant fuel for them to use. Again, with my initial plan on this being a live discussion, I was going to stand up and say, all right, who here knows about the third brewery of Chippewa Falls? I think I was going to stump the experts with that one because, yes, for a little while anyway, in the 1870s, Chippewa Falls had three breweries going at once. Schmidmeyer, that got started the first but was kind of on its way out by the mid 1870s. Leinenkugel up the creek here a little ways that got going in 1867. And this odd little place that I've marked with a red arrow that was the Union Brewery. It seems to have been put together by some local investors with a guy who maybe knew a little bit about brewing beer, and even the exact years of operation are unclear. They possibly only brewed beer for a few months in the 1870s. And here's the site today. It looks like a pretty reasonable place for a brewery. Duncan Creek's right behind me. There's the hillside, now occupied by an apartment building for old folks. Clearly, the best preserved 19th century brewery in our immediate area is the Leinenkugel's Brewery. But close second actually is the brewery in Bloomer, Wisconsin. Now, a lot of people probably don't even know that Bloomer had a brewery, but it did. A lot of the smaller communities did at that period of time. And the brewery in Bloomer got started in 1872. It seems to have had a modicum of success despite more than the average number of ownership changes and fires. But it kept going and even had a bit of a post-Prohibition mini boom. It, for among other things, got a contract for brewing beer for the armed forces during World War II. This photo is probably circa 1900. Here is what the place looks like today. After the brewery went out of business, the physical building was used for a variety of other things, including a trucking company. And the owner of the trucking company, a gentleman named Stoltz, was a home brewer. And in the 1980s, he decided to take his hobby and park it in a little corner of this building that he was renting for his business. I ran across some comments that said that he set up his little brewing operation in a portion of the existing storage caves, which of course quite got my interest. Mr. Stoltz's little sideline evolved, and eventually he started, or we should say restarted, the Bloomer Brewing Company, making beer in the old facility. I had a chance to go there and spend a little time at their tap room talking with some old timers, and eventually I said, hey, I want to see that cave down in the basement. But before we get there, I should just mention, for whatever reason, possibly just the physical survival of the plant, there's an awful lot of memorabilia artifacts from the Bloomer Brewery that are still in existence, and you'll run across them as you go here and there. Okay, so let's have a look at that cave down in the basement of the Bloomer Brewery, and this will be my introduction to you of the Bloomer mystery. Yeah, there it is. Now, we haven't really ventured too far into a lot of these caves yet, but take it from me, they typically go back 100 feet, give or take, a little into the hillside, which is really what you need to get the constant temperature that you need for lager beer. And so they took me down here, I looked at it, and said, hey, this thing only goes back 10 or 15 feet. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, I guess there's lots of possible explanations. Is that a newer wall that's been put in there to seal up a much older cave? Could be, although that doesn't look like real new construction. I mean, in the last 50 years, if you wanted to hire somebody to build a wall, could you find anyone who would do stonework like that? Heck, they'd probably just use a cinder block. Or is it possible that this was just a little antechamber? Sometimes you'd see places that had a bigger storage cave somewhere else and would have just a little side room that they would park some kegs of beer that were just getting ready to be shipped out and didn't need to be kept very cold for very long. But there's a problem here, and the problem is not one that goes back to the 1860s and 70s, but one that goes back to the 1960s, if I may explain. In the early 1960s, we had a little dust-up with the Soviet Union called the Cuban Missile Crisis. It all resolved happily, but in the wake of that, the Department of Defense said, that could have got bad, and maybe we should make some preparations in case nuclear Armageddon really does happen. So, a significant survey of all underground spaces in America was undertaken with the idea that, hey, if things get really bad, we need to tell people where they can go and shelter underground. Tunnels, mines, all kinds of facilities were surveyed, rated for how many people could fit in there. And interestingly to me, quite a few brewery caves made it onto this list, including the cave in Bloomer, which was rated for, if memory serves, 520 red-blooded American citizens. Okay, to me that looks like it's going to be a pretty tight fit, not exactly a comfortable way to ride out nuclear Armageddon. So where is the cave that you're going to fit all these people into? 1964, when this report came out, was not that far in the past. And some of the old timers that I had a beer with upstairs probably were around back then, and none of them remember anything. The most I came up with was, I believe, the son of Mr. Stoltz, who says, yeah, I remember back when we first moved into the place, there was a bunch of civil defense signs hanging around. So I have no idea where the cave that the others say 500 people are going to fit into is, but it must be there somewhere, and I'd love to find it someday. Okay, as this was a program for the Chippewa Valley Museum that serves our entire area, I did want to include a few places outside the immediate Chippewa Falls, Eau Claire area. So let's take a visit to Menominee, Wisconsin, which had two breweries, both of them, not surprisingly, outside of town. This one was a couple of miles outside of town and is referred to as the Hudson Road Brewery, obviously west of town, in the general direction of Hudson. I just like this picture. It shows a lot of interesting features that you've come to recognize. And it also has an interesting view of the inside of the brewery. This, I think, is an example of trying to use gravity to get the work done. I believe this is a bit of machinery where the laborious process of malting the grain could be somewhat automated. Looks to me like the grain was dumped in from above. The various pipes and things probably involved spraying water on it, which was necessary on a regular basis. And then it would have to be slowly turned over and heated. So this looks like a nice setup to do that. Obviously, it still required multiple guys to get the serious work done. This is the other brewery in Menominee. Helpful hint for researchers if you are trying to locate a brewery. Look for things named like Brewery Hill and Brewery Creek, quite handy. In this case, the Christian Fuss Brewery was right along the Red Cedar River, where a little creek empties in. But it's a bit of an enigma in some other ways. So yeah, we're going to have another little mystery at the end of this one. This is the original location of the brewery in the 1860s. In the 1870s, it burned down. This time felt to be arson, and was relocated a little bit higher up on the hill. The original location of the brewery, as seen here, is said to be where the entrance to the brewery caves were. So here is an 1885 Sanborn fire insurance map showing the new location of the brewery up on top of the hill. The old location, and probably where the entrance to the caves is that little yellow square marked shed off to the left. But I want you to focus for the moment on a couple of things. In the description up above, it says steam pump and beer cellar 50 feet below brewery in bed of rock. Well, that sounds fairly straightforward. And I'd also like you to take a look at the little yellow square marked shed at the bottom of the map here. So, next picture. That looks like the little shed that's hanging right off the edge of the cliff. Unfortunately, whoever took this photo decided it was more important to show the guy catching the fish than to provide an image of a historic brewery. And in fact, I don't think there are any existing photographs of this brewery in the 19th century. Come on, guys, would it have hurt to move the camera a little bit to the left and snap one more picture? Best we can do, I suppose, is this picture, which is clearly well into the 20th century and shows the ruins of the building up on top of the hill. Yeah, about that hill, I'm not quite sure how you managed to have a pump in the cave 50 feet beneath the brewery when the hill is about 35 feet tall. I just haven't been able to figure that out. Okay, we're going to come back to Eau Claire for a while now, and what I'm showing you here is a really interesting, very rare photo that I found working with the archivists at the Chippewa Valley Museum. This is a brewery that might have been the first brewery in Eau Claire. It was started by a couple of gentlemen named Stiting and Wingen, 1859, near as we can figure, and it was on the west side of town. They ran it for a few years. Things got a little hard to follow during the Civil War, and then in the later 1860s and 1870s, it was run by other people. This photo was dated 1874, and it says Brewery of Henry Leinenkugel and Son. So yes, another of the Leinenkugels ran this for a time. The brewery burned down in the mid-1880s, and if you were to walk over this site today, you would see absolutely no trace that anything was ever there. But that's not to say that there are no traces. This is a photo, I don't know the exact time period, of the brewery cave underneath that west side brewery. It is a location that I really can't encourage people to go and explore. Possibly when I show you a few more pictures of it in the modern era, you'll appreciate that. So this is what it looked like. I'm guessing 1900 maybe. Is the same area today. You can see that the entrance to this cave has had various attempts to wall it up and keep people from going in. These have not been entirely successful. Up in the roof of this cave is something that I have to say I'd never seen anywhere before or since. This is a big wooden hatch, and it clearly went up to the brewery buildings that you saw in the earlier slide and was used to convey kegs of beer down into the storage cave. Presumably this is a very early feature, and so you're looking at wood that was probably put in place in the late 1850s. Still in pretty good shape. In the wall adjacent to that wooden hatch is this niche that has an interesting stripe of rust there in a pattern that suggests to me there was some kind of piece of machinery there, probably a hand crank that you could use to raise that wooden platform up and down. So basically, you had a beer elevator. This cave is largely unspoiled, but not entirely. I really don't know why people feel it's necessary to go into underground places and leave unsightly and frankly very unoriginal graffiti. I'm quite certain that there are no secret satanic cults meeting underground in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Of somewhat more interest, I suppose, to our program is notice the little up and down lines in the stone. These are the actual pickaxe marks that were used when they excavated this cave, again, presumably in the late 1850s. And the way that this worked was they really sought out a specific kind of stone called the St. Peter sandstone. And in its original form, it's very easy to work with even simple hand tools. But when it's been exposed to air for a while, it turns into something absolutely rock solid and stable. This is a wider view of the inside of the cave. It has some side branches here and there, and you can see that well, some locals have moved in some chairs, and I don't know exactly what they do down there, but it wasn't messed up too badly. I also noted just in the process of preparing this program that that cement floor must be relatively new. It certainly didn't show up in that first picture of the cave that I showed you. So it seems to me as if there was some relatively recent use of this cave for something else, and I look forward to learning more about that someday. I took this picture to look at that rusty pipe that you see in the lower part of the image. It is some sort of electrical conduit. At the time, I was thinking, hey, isn't that interesting? In the 1880s, beer caves probably already had electricity, which makes sense. You want to be able to see what you're doing down there, and the whole point of aging caves is to keep a constant cool temperature, so you don't want to have like kerosene lamps down there. Um, Now that I'm starting to think that there was some possibly early 20th century use of the cave for something, I'm not quite so sure that that's 1880s technology. But what I actually ended up taking a better picture of, rather than what I thought I was taking a picture of, was this interesting little colony of cave crickets. Yeah, when you're exploring brewery caves, you do run into a few inhabitants. Crickets, bats, of course, occasionally homeless people. Okay, a little side trip, if we can, to the marvelous city of La Crosse, Wisconsin, a major brewing center. This is the brewery of the Michaels Brewing Company, started by Charles and James Michaels. Clearly, this is a much later facility, I think from 1903 or so. But the Michaels brothers, a very interesting and somewhat atypical story with respect to the brewing industry. For one thing, they were not immigrants. They were second or third generation Germans who came, I think, from Germantown, Pennsylvania. They set out in 1849 for the gold rush, hoping to make their fortunes in California. And I guess they actually did make a fair amount of money, not mining gold, but they had some abilities as builders and masons. So they were doing some construction work in San Francisco and up into the mining areas. They eventually grew disenchanted with it in the 1850s and were looking for new opportunities. They had an idea that they wanted to move to St. Paul, Minnesota, so they got on a Mississippi River steamboat, headed upstream, but unfortunately the spring ice conditions were such that they couldn't go any further than La Crosse, and that's where they were stranded. They looked around a little bit, said, hey, we kind of like it here, and went into business. Initially, they probably were in the construction business again, but they must have had some early contact with the brewing industry. I've seen a brewery cave from the 1850s that has some design features that are very, very distinctive, and I think are the work of the Michaels brothers. So in 1857, they decided they were going to go into the brewing business in their own right and establish their own brewery. What they did for the first few years for beer storage is unclear. Um, But eventually they decided it was time to excavate their own cave, which I believe they did with their own bare hands and tools. Here's the cave excavated by the Michaels brothers. They were helpful enough to actually carve their name in the wall of the cave, as well as the date, 1864. And here you can see quite prominently the little pickaxe marks that came from the process of excavating a very nicely made cave. Here's the cave today. Now, in 1864, this cave was quite actively in use by the brewery, but the Michaels Brewery grew to be a very sizable enterprise, and by the 1880s it switched over to mechanical refrigeration, and it excavated some very deep cellars in their downtown brewery. So they didn't really need this lagering cave anymore and used it primarily just to store various stuff. Later, in the early years of the 20th century, it was used, interestingly, to grow celery on a rather large scale. And what you see it being set up for here is a somewhat similar purpose. There's a guy who was getting this set up when I visited to grow mushrooms commercially. This is actually a relatively common thing that you see brewery caves being used for. But in between the mushroom era and the celery era, there was one rather interesting episode in the cave's life that I do need to relate. Now, a lot of people think that it was Prohibition that did in all the pioneer breweries, and that's really not true, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the program. But it certainly didn't help the breweries much, and they were trying to limp by as best they can. At this point in time, this storage cave was not being used by anybody, and the farmer who owned the land was approached by a guy who says, "Hey, I want to rent it." Well, what it turns out he was doing was buying near beer, that low alcohol stuff that breweries were making to try to keep the doors open, um, taking it to this cave and adding grain alcohol to it to give it a little extra kick. Well, the authorities found out about it, raided the joint, all the beer. What you see here are the kegs and cases of beer that had been seized. This is no longer in the cave, by the way. For a little theatrical effect, they locked it up in a jail cell and took a picture of it. Boy, this made the news for a few days. The gentleman involved in this nefarious practice was taken to trial, rather quickly convicted and fined. The beer was taken down to the Mississippi River and poured into the Father of Waters to the reported delight of the local fish populations. But a few more questions were actually necessary to be asked, shall we say. So the authorities first went to the farmer and said, "Hey, did you know what was going on in that cave on your property?" And the farmer says, "No, not really. I mean, this guy just slipped an envelope full of cash under my kitchen door once a month, and I just assumed it was all on the up and up, so, hey." And the authorities said, "Good enough." You have to remember that in Wisconsin, prohibition was more an abstract concept than the law of the land. Next, they went to the Heileman Brewing Company, who had provided the near beer, and they said, "Hey, did you know that somebody was taking your product, adding alcohol, and making an illegal beverage out of it?" And the Heileman Company responded, "Horrors! What a terrible idea! You can but imagine our surprise. No, no, we knew nothing about it." Now, I just have to add as an editorial comment that one of the brands of near beer that Heileman was selling at this time was Spike. Yeah. Like it says in the logo there, it's a hit every time. So now we'll go back to Eau Claire, and this time we're going to stay there till the end of our program. The biggest brewery in Eau Claire, and pretty much in a tie for the earliest brewery, was the Eau Claire Eagle Brewery, started again in the late 1850s by yet another Leinenkugel, in this case Matthias Leinenkugel, who was named after his father, the original Leinenkugel, down in Sauk City. As you can see, it stood on the hillside directly below Sacred Heart Church and Hospital. And it was a rather substantial establishment, which has entirely vanished. There is, near as I can tell, absolutely nothing left of it. It was at its time a very successful enterprise, though. Um, although Matthias himself died in 1874. At that point, the business was taken over by his widow, Teresa, who seems to have thumbed her nose at that German tradition that you're supposed to marry the foreman, and carried on in her own right quite successfully until 1886 when she too died. At that point, the various pressures on regional smaller breweries were becoming pretty intense, and the business went into a decline and eventually went out of business altogether in 1912. Here's a brewery that some of you listening to this might actually remember and perhaps remember sampling their wares. We're talking about the John Wolter's Brewery of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I do see that whoever made this little picture postcard spelled it wrong. John Wolters came to town rather late, 1890, which certainly doesn't qualify him for inclusion in a program on pioneer breweries of western Wisconsin. But he took over an existing brewery that had been there since the 1870s. This one had also had many ownership changes, had also been owned by some Leinenkugels for a while, and it had more than their share of fires. Um, but John Walters took it over and actually made a fairly successful venture out of it. It grew steadily through some challenging times in the brewing industry, and then, of course, was shut down during Prohibition. After Prohibition, it came back, continued to even grow for a while, and really was able to hang in there fairly well until I believe they finally went out of business in 1985. I was of an age to consume malted beverages by then, and I do remember drinking their stuff that had their logo on the label. Kind of one of those logo mottos that's entirely impossible to argue with. The beer that is beer. There was a brief effort to revive it as the Hibernia Brewing Company for a few years in the late 1880s, but pretty much everything is now gone. This is a picture of the John Walters Brewery in better days, and this is what I call an occupational photo. These are very common with breweries. It was felt to be important to show the guys who work there and the tools of their trade. Your eye, of course, is almost immediately caught by those really great advertising signs that I would love to have. But otherwise, you look and you see the kegs back behind there. You see some grain shovels in the front. The guy in the back row in the center has got one of these things I think they used to pull the moist grain around when they were doing the malting process. I see a guy on the right in the back row with a big hammer. That would be the cooper who makes the barrels. And in the front row, you have one guy intently, carefully studying a glass of beer that he's holding up for color and clarity and all that. That must be the brewmaster. And sitting next to him is a man with a great big stein. Gotta be the owner because, hey, if you're the owner, you get the big stein. This is pretty much the only building standing from the John Walters Brewery. It is the Bottlery. This was built in about 1913, just before things got kind of difficult with the First World War and then Prohibition, and is still standing on the site. Most of the other main buildings are long gone. However, researching this program, I walked around the corner and I saw this. It's clearly a very modern and frankly rather unattractive building, but it's built on some interesting old foundations. And in recent years, some of that really hideous fake stucco-y stuff on the walls has fallen off and has revealed a very old looking foundation. So, up view, you can even see windows. I believe this is the part of the foundation of the original 1870s brewery on the site, and this is part of the establishment that John Walters took over when he came on the scene in 1890. Kind of nice to, even after many years of being in the area and studying local history, to just stumble across a neat little find like this. All right, I'm going to now introduce you to one of the more remarkable characters that you will meet in local brewery history, E. Robert Hanch. Like an awful lot of the small brewers in Pioneer, Wisconsin, he was originally German and emigrated to America, but he did not come directly here. No, he had an interesting little career as a mercenary, as a soldier of fortune. He was affiliated with a truly outrageous adventurer named John Walker, and Walker's thing in life was trying to overthrow Central American governments. Uh, After a couple of false starts, Walker and his men actually did manage to take over Nicaragua for about 18 months, and Walker became El Presidente. Now, this did not end well for Walker. He ended up in front of a firing squad, but his men, including E. Robert Hanch, seem to have gotten out with their skins mostly intact, and Hanch ends up in Eau Claire circa 1858. Probably from the get-go, he was in the wholesale liquor business. Here's an early ad. Kind of shows the diversity of things he sold: wines, liquors, tobaccos, cigars. But the real interesting feature in his life came in 1862 and his role in the Great Indian Scare. Now, for context, you need to know that in 1862, the Lakota over in Minnesota were very badly treated by the government in general, Indian agents in particular, and staged a violent uprising, killing a lot of settlers, burning a lot of homesteads, and even some small communities. The initial military efforts to put down the what's became known as the Sioux Uprising failed in defeat, and all across the frontier there were some very, very nervous people. Now, in 1862, Eau Claire was not, by any stretch of the imagination, on the frontier. There was still some concern, though, that the local Indian population might rise up in solidarity with their Lakota brethren. That's kind of nonsense, really. The local native population were Ojibwe, and they did not like the Lakota even one little bit. In fact, they were traditional enemies. But worried people are not always logical people. And pretty soon there was rumors circulating. Somebody claimed that they had seen a war party down in the river bottoms, and there was some smoke on the horizon up towards Elk Mound, and it was felt to be a horde of savages coming to burn everything in their path. Well, it was decided that some sort of a military force was necessary just in case. At this era in time, of course, all the guys of military age and aptitude had already joined the Union Army and were off fighting in the East. So what they had to turn to was the Eau Claire Militia. This was a largely social organization of doctors, lawyers, and merchants. Kind of think of it as being sort of like the Kiwanis, but hey, it was what was available. So they were called out, and it was decided that Captain E.R. Hanch would be responsible for drilling the troops, teaching them the basics. He got this job partly on the basis of prior service in the Prussian army, of course, his time with Walker down in Nicaragua, and allegedly because he was the only man in the county who owned a sword. He did not find his recruits to be particularly adept. They were maybe not taking it seriously. They were not very good at marching in lines. At one point, Hanch took his sword and used the flat of it to swat one fellow across the rear end, saying, "Get back in line, you damned big bug." I think Hanch was a fairly wise individual, though, and after a few frustrating hours, he reflected upon things and said, most battles are actually not won by tactics, but by supply and logistics. So he decided the thing to do was adjourn for the day and supply the Eau Claire militia with significant amounts of lager beer. By the next morning, it was evident as the sun rose that there was actually no enemy to fight. The Eau Claire militia also rose a bit less promptly and uh, headed for home with their heads held high, if probably somewhat aching. So, Hanch carried on this interesting business. He referred to his establishment as being at the sign of the two barrels. Here's a little newspaper blurb indicating he has a stock of wines, liquors, herrings, pickled eel, bologna, sausage, candies, etc. Talks about all the wines and brandies and such that he sold. And at a fairly early era, he also got involved on the manufacturing side of things. He had a distillery. He also manufactured vinegar. One really hopes that it wasn't a matter of just sampling each batch and deciding which label to put on there. And circa 1870, thereby a fairly latecomer to the business, he got into brewing beer. He did this with some success for about a decade and used a cave in the riverbank overlooking the current Uniroyal plant to age the beer. He sold the beer in these magnificent pottery bottles stamped with his name, E.R. Hanch. They come in pint and supposedly also in quart sizes. No one's ever seen the latter. And they are absolutely great, and I would love to have one someday. Here's the cave that Hanch used. It is, again, a cave that I can um, tell you that you could visit, but please be careful. The riverbank can be a little slippery at times, but on a very nice dry day, I don't see a particular problem if a person wanted to walk over there and have a look. Now, Hanch went out of business in the early 1880s. The next user of the cave were some people who stored dynamite there. After that, around the turn of the century, it was used as a changing room. There was a swimming facility in the river down below this cave. Probably at that time, an interesting individual turns up here, a woman, but no, not the one you're expecting. She turns up later. Some girls who worked in a local factory were on break, walked by, peeked into the cave, and saw the slumped form of a woman there. They ran to the authorities saying, "There's a dead woman in the beer cave." Said authorities showed up, took a look, and said, "She's dead all right, dead drunk." This is a little image of the inside of the cave, a little bit out of sequence, but I think it sort of reflects the interesting parade of people who have passed through there. But back to the slumped figure in the cave. It was Mrs. Jules Anklum, and the newspaper article rather unkindly says she is the condensed extract of 3 barrels of alcohol, and her hubby is the straight stuff. They were apparently local drunkards whose carryings on scandalized the neighborhood. I don't know exactly what the neighbors were seeing through those windows that had no blinds on them, but it was enough to create constant indignation. All rather unkind from a modern perspective. The next inhabitant of the cave, of course, was Violet Lee, the so-called Mad Poetess. Violet was an interesting individual, and I need to be very careful to be fair here. She was clearly a very artistic person, very outspoken. She held political views that were considerably ahead of her time, but rather more in sync with ours. She was married to sort of a non-entity named Wilbur, who was a music teacher. She had a number of children by him. She carried on a very active correspondence in the pages of the local newspaper, a mixture of published poetry and various feuds with local officials and other writers. One thing led to another, and in the latter part of 1917, Violet and her family were evicted from their house. So they figured, well, we'll just move into the old beer cave on the banks of the river. And so they did. There's a rather detailed description of the local authorities coming to visit them there. This was later evidence at her sanity hearing, but the newspaper says the following. Before entering the cave, one is met with a flagpole placed in front of the entrance upon which Old Glory waves. At the base of this flagpole is an old boiler that is lit upon the arrival of the twilight hours to help drive away the mosquitoes and keep away the chill of the early morning. The interior of the cave is laid with carpet on the floor, and a curtain divides the cave into two parts. There is furniture, which includes an oil stove, chairs, bureau, and bed. A table in the center of the room is piled high with books, manuscripts, and paper. A large dictionary has a prominent place amongst the chaos. Now, people at her sanity trial said this really isn't any worse than the conditions in a lot of working-class houses up on the hill there. But Violet did not help her cause all that much. She was also a believer in free love, and some discussion at the trial about affairs she'd had with various prominent people led her to say, I believe that it is a woman's right to love, and if she cannot love her husband, she must love another. Well, that didn't go over real well, and Violet was committed to the state insane asylum down in Madison, not for the first time, by the way, at which commitment she renewed her basic core principles by having an affair with her psychiatrist. I have some samples of Violet Lee's poetry. Some of it's a little over the top, but I'm not a literary critic, so I can't really judge it. I will say, though, that if you're interested in it, what I'm holding in my hand here is a compilation of her poetry written by Violet Lee herself in her own hand in this ledger book. This is clearly a accumulation of poetry from quite a few different years. It makes references to the births and birthdays of various children, for instance, and must have been put together at a time when she had plenty of, free time. So I rather wonder if this little compilation of poetry was not composed while she was actually in the insane asylum. It's at the archives at UW-Eau Claire if you ever want to have a look at it. It does make for an interesting read. Speaking of interesting, some local performers called the Torch Sisters put on a one-night-only celebration of the life of Violet Lee, also known as Maud Phillips. They describe what they do as decadent burlesque, I believe, and I really wish I would have made it to this one-night-only performance. There were aerial acts, there were recitations of the poetry, whatever the hell this is, and it seems like it really would have been an interesting thing to witness. Um, I regret missing it. I do like to imagine that from somewhere in the great beyond, Violet Lee, aka Maud Phillips, was looking down and smiling. Well, clearly I have wandered a little bit from my initial presentation, which was slightly scholarly discussion of small breweries as part of German culture. But from the beginnings in the 1850s, I'm going to finish up with a silly little story from the 1950s. Because there's one more tale regarding the E.R. Hanch cave, and oddly, it also involves explosives. In December of 1953, two young lads, Don Anderson, age 13, and Larry Schaefer, age 12, were playing on the riverbank, apparently at the cave, and noticed a small box from which ticking noises were coming out. Being intrepid explorers, of course, they looked at it, opened it up, saw that there was a clock, some wires, and some other stuff in there, and ran away. Then stopped, ran back, and pulled the wires loose. At this point, they picked the presumed homemade bomb up and brought it home to Larry's house. Uh, I'm going to retrospectively nominate both of Larry's parents for Parent of the 20th Century Award. Larry's mom looked at it and said, "Yeah, looks like a bomb. Go show your father." Larry's father did one better. He unscrewed one end of the little pipe, dumped some of the powder out, touched a match to it, and when it went poof, he says, "Yeah, that is a bomb. Perhaps we should call the police." I never really found any follow-up on this case when you look at this enthusiastic young lad and the whole story about how he knew it was a bomb because we saw on television where they had bombs like that on Dragnet. You do have to just kind of wonder if Larry and Donnie didn't make that thing themselves. But history does not record the answer to that question. All right, we've come to the end of our little discussion on the birth, life, death, and rebirth of small breweries in America. If you can hang in there a few more minutes, I will give you a bit of an overview. People have been drinking beer in America since colonial days, obviously, but early on it was mostly ale, the sort of stuff that could be brewed on a small scale, basically in your kitchen. And it wasn't until the great wave of German emigration that started in the late 1840s that lager beer came on the scene. And lager beer, as you've seen, requires a very specific, more industrial, I guess you'd say, setup to make. So the number of breweries in America that we'd recognize as something more than little household enterprises really didn't start to take off until the 1840s, but boy, it grew rapidly from that point forward. There was one little setback, though, in 1862 when the economic pressure of fighting the Civil War caused one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, to take an action that must stand forever as a black mark on his presidency: the first federal tax on beer. But the war itself, the years afterward, were times of continued emigration and economic expansion, and the number of breweries in America continued to rise to a peak in 1873 of 4,131. One assumes there were a few smaller ones or off-the-books ones that weren't quite counted there. That was the high water mark, and a lot of people, I think understandably, just figure, well, it was Prohibition that did him in. Short answer, no. Because almost immediately in the mid-1870s, the number of breweries started to drop, and drop quickly. By 1890, there was only 2,000 left, so less than half. So what happened? Well, the reality is that a lot of these little breweries sprung up as sort of mom and pop operations, maybe just a few employees. And although the proprietors were sincere, hardworking individuals, they were operating on a scale not too far above a modern home brewer. And if you know a little bit about home brewing, you know you make some really good batches and some that maybe aren't so good. It might not always even be the fault of the brewers. It's not always easy to get the exact ingredients you need at the right time in a pioneer type situation. In particular, hops, which were a major crop in Wisconsin in the 1860s on into the 1870s. Well, hop production absolutely cratered in the mid-1870s for a variety of reasons, and production of hops became a much more organized, centralized industry that had shifted to where it still is today out in the Pacific Northwest, made it kind of hard for small brewers to get exactly what they needed at reasonable prices since they couldn't buy locally. But there were some other things going on at the same time. Certain communities, I'm thinking Milwaukee, St. Paul, La Crosse, Cincinnati, St. Louis, just emerged as centers of brewing excellence. They all had good-sized communities of Germans. There was some money in town. The brewers there could invest in better, more modern equipment. Some scientific advances came along, like mechanical refrigeration. And in general, in these communities that became known as brewing communities, um, beer was being produced on a larger scale with more scientific methods, and frankly, it was overall just better beer, or at least, consistently better. And it wasn't long before, terms like Milwaukee would be a selling point for your beer. Um, the real thing that broke the back, though, of the small brewers was the fact that these bigger entities started marketing on a regional, national, even international basis, using the newly developed network of railroads that now crisscross the whole country, and special refrigerated cars. You could put kegs of really good Milwaukee beer on into a boxcar, send it somewhere, and it could be distributed quickly, and more particularly to chains of saloons that were owned by these brewers. Eventually, even the small market for home use was taken away from the locals because, well, putting in lines that can bottle beer is a little bit of an expense. That weeded out a few of the smaller enterprises. And eventually, the big outfits just set up bottling agencies in places like Eau Claire to take the kegs, put the beer up in bottles, and sell it to the mass market. Um, Things got pretty tight, and by World War I, when resources were already being diverted away from other things towards the war effort, um, there was only 1,000 breweries left in America. So Prohibition, when it came along a couple of years later, really uh, didn't wipe out the small breweries of America because they were pretty much all gone already. After Prohibition was repealed, uh, some of the brewers made it back out of the dark years. Others did not. The ones that did had a bit of a modest boom in their business. The population had grown. People still liked beer. Um, but there never was the sort of growth in numbers of breweries that had characterized the 19th century. In fact, there was a gradual diminishing of the numbers of breweries. Small ones went out of business, big ones got bigger. The absolute low point was reached in 1978. At that point, there were literally 42 breweries in America. Now, that's not to say there was only 42 places brewing beer, but what had developed was a situation where literally a small number, just a few dozen companies still existed, and they had great big, let's call them what they are, factories set up to brew a product that we can charitably call beer in all different parts of the country. They were able to use the new marketing agencies of television to mass advertise their product, and it was frankly rather dark times for beer drinkers in America. And then something happened that I guess is the isomer, the mirror image of Abe Lincoln's actions in 1862. Because in 1878, one of our less successful presidents, Jimmy Carter, had one inspired moment. He legalized home brewing. Well, this didn't immediately bring back small breweries, but what it created was a large body of people who now were getting back into home brewing, finding that it was fun, finding that they liked having different styles of beer that they made themselves. Um, no small number of these people had their little hobby get out of control, and they started up little microbreweries, which now happily have spread across the land. In 2015, America hit a significant landmark. We were back to the same number of breweries that we had in 1873. Now, of course, there's more than 5,000. An exact tally is kind of hard to even make today because so many new ones are springing up. I will just mention a couple in passing that are among my favorites. On the very doorstep of Francis X. Schmidmeyer's Pioneer Brewery in Chippewa Falls, you've got the Brewster Brothers Brewery making some excellent beverages right next door to where brewing started in our area. And within a nice stroll of the Chippewa Valley Museum and a couple of brewery caves I could take you to, we have the Lazy Monk Brewery, where I gave my first version of this talk in the friendly confines of their tap room. So I will conclude today's talk just by raising a metaphorical toast to the small brewers of America, uh, past, present, and future, and long may they keep up their good work. Thanks for your attention, folks. Good evening.